Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Yang, the Recruit, Retain, Reactivate R3 Partnership Coordinator here at the Minnesota DNR. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for a presentation on Minnesota's rare fish species. This is the 241st edition of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series, or MOS for short. Today we're joined by Brett Nagle, the native fish biologist, and he'll give a presentation about sampling for Minnesota's rare fish species. Throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them with the Slido function on the bottom right. To access that, just find the three dots and click the ellipses. And at the end of the presentation, my colleague Jenny will ask Brett the questions that you asked. So with that, I'll transition to Brett to talk more about himself and his presentation.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. My name is Brett Nagle. I'm the native fish biologist here in the section of fisheries at Minnesota DNR. The native fish biologist is a new position. I just started in that role about a year and a half ago. Prior to that, for 10 years, I did fish community sampling in streams and rivers throughout Minnesota with the Minnesota Pollution Control's biological monitoring. And before that, I was at the DNR in the Minnesota Biological Survey, primarily doing surveys for rare fishes. So today we're going to meet a bunch of cool rare fish that are native to Minnesota, and we'll talk about what we know about them, and in many cases what we don't know about them. And yeah, oh, there we go. So Minnesota famously has lots of lakes, and reasonable people can argue about what or does not constitute a lake, but at the end of the day, we've got a lot of them, certainly more than Wisconsin. In addition to more than 14,000 lakes in our state, we have over 10 million acres of wetlands and more than 90,000 miles of streams and rivers. And the diverse habitats within those aquatic features are home to more than 160 species of fish, and more than 140 of those are native to Minnesota waters. And of those 140-ish native species, 41 of them have some sort of conservation designation in the state. And so about 30% of our native fishes have some limited distribution or are limited in numbers in some way. And we'll dive into those today. While we're on the topic of native fish, if you'd like to learn more about our native fishes, I encourage you to check out the Moss webinar from this past April that was given by Shannon Fisher, seen here lovingly hugging this beautiful paddlefish. Shannon has really led the charge here at DNR and nationally on the conservation and management of native fish species. He also hired me, so yeah, he must be doing something right. So I put a link up to there. You can grab that. The links will also be posted in the chat, so you don't need to worry about trying to write down a URL with any of the other links that I might put up here. So now I'd like to go over some factors that can really influence what can cause a species to be considered rare within Minnesota. A fish's species-wide distribution, that is their distribution across wherever they're found, might only contain a portion of Minnesota. And we have many species that are kind of at the northern limit of their range. It is often the case with populations on the edge of a species' distribution that are just a bit more vulnerable than those that are in the heart of the distribution. And perhaps those on the edge are kind of getting out of the Goldilocks zone or sweet spot of environmental and climatic conditions that allows a species to thrive. So here we can see a distribution here that just barely peaks into Minnesota, but that is still a fish that is native within our borders, and it's our duty to make sure they can persist here. Conversely, We have a number of boreal, kind of northern distributed species who are at the southern limit of their range in northern Minnesota. So obviously, fish are not concerned with, nor do they pay attention to political boundaries. But like I said, we do have a duty to maintain the natural diversity within our borders. Just kind of another note on distribution and how biogeography can really play into this. So these are just 6 distributions of rare or threatened fish. There's actually more than 10 of these that kind of have this similar distribution just in the southeast corner of the state. And that's for a couple reasons. One of which is that this lower portion of the Mississippi is where we have our kind of large continental scale river habitat. Huge channel, backwaters, sloughs. From the headwaters at Itasca, obviously the Mississippi River is very small there, but as the Mississippi flows through the continent, it gets much larger. And so we have a number of species that are adapted to this massive river scale. So that's part of it, in particular for, oops, I don't have that map up here. Never mind. Another factor here with the Southeast um, is these high gradient, fast flowing gravel bottom streams in Minnesota's bluff country that is part of what is known as the driftless area. And so this is a part of the Midwest that was missed by the most recent round of glaciation during the Pleistocene and likely served as a refuge for some of these kind of highland character species that are much more broadly distributed in the Ozark Plateau and across Appalachia. So they may have used this refugium and in some cases dispersed farther into Minnesota or other parts of the Midwest, or many of these are really bound to those specific habitat types. And so anyway, this distribution is something we see in a lot of our rare fishes. Some species just naturally occur in low numbers relative to other species and constitute a minor percentage of the overall fish community. Even long before the accumulation of human impacts on populations, some species were rare, even at the earliest efforts to describe and characterize them. Others are just particularly secretive or cryptic, which is to say that they're really good at hiding. Here we can see a Western sand darter, which wildly is a mostly transparent animal. You can actually see through the sides of these fish when you hold them in your hand. They blend right in over the substrate, and they also have the habit of burrowing into the sand so that only their eyes are exposed. They're also really long and skinny, kind of noodly fish, and they can slip through even the fine mesh nets that we use for surveying small fishes. So some fish are just hard to find and hard to catch if you do find them. Habitat can also be a big factor. In many cases, a particular habitat that the fish or the food that it eats, the habitat itself is rare or vulnerable. They may occur in remote and difficult to access localities, or for example, like at the bottom of our deepest lakes in the border lakes. We also have many examples of a very small fish in a very large body of water that just presents some challenges when sampling, monitoring, and assessing a population. And for many of our rare fishes, it's some combination of these and other factors that impact this ability to really survey and know what's going on with the population. So a good example of this is the state endangered crystal darter, which is a close relative of the sand darter that we just talked about. They also can be semi-transparent. They like to burrow into the substrate. They're often found in waters that are too deep to wade or sample with seines. We will talk a little bit more about crystal darters in a minute. Excuse me. So rare and endangered species are protected by law in Minnesota. Excuse me. Okay, we're back. Rare and endangered species are protected by law in Minnesota, and the DNR is tasked with maintaining a list of all the species that require these additional protections. The current lists and designations within these categories are actually up for review in the next year or so. And this is really a major undertaking. If you think of all of the plants, mammals, birds, lichens, insects, fish, etc., this process involves extensive review of published research and survey data to determine which species meet the criteria and in some cases require a change in their designation. So let's run through these three main categories in the law. The species is considered endangered if threatened with extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range within Minnesota. So even if there's a case where a species is abundant throughout its native range, but only occurs in a single lake or reach of stream, that population does require special protection. We don't want to permanently lose any of our species that occur naturally within our borders. A species is considered threatened if it is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future throughout all or a significant portion of its range in Minnesota. And finally, kind of the broadest category is called special concern. And a species is considered special concern if it's extremely uncommon in Minnesota or has unique and highly specific habitat requirements and deserves careful monitoring of its status. So as it stands today, we have 4 fish species that are endangered, 5 that are threatened, and 25 that are of special concern. So let's try to meet as many of these charming fish as we can in our brief time today. So our 4 endangered fish species in Minnesota are the skipjack herring, the slender mad tom, the pallid shiner, and the crystal darter. So skipjack herring is a freshwater herring that was historically widespread in North America's large rivers. These fish are highly migratory and made these massive upstream spawning runs in the spring. The construction of the lock and dam system in the early 1900s turned our great rivers into a series of navigation pools that were separated by these impassable dams that in many cases are a hard and fast barrier to migratory fish. And indeed, most riverine fishes are migratory to some extent. The completion of Lock and Dam 19 at Keokuk, Iowa, indicated here with this big red arrow, was kind of the beginning of the end for this species in Minnesota. It once ranged from Big Stone Lake throughout the Minnesota, Mississippi, and St. Croix rivers, but these populations quickly dwindled when their access to these waters were cut off by a gigantic dam. They have, on rare occasions, been able to bypass these dams during flood events and do occasionally appear in Minnesota in small numbers. However, the last time that we have direct evidence of them spawning in Minnesota through the collection of young of the year, that is baby fish, that was in 1986. There are records more recently, after the 2000s of individuals appearing here and there, but very few and far between. And we don't believe that they are spawning in Minnesota anymore. Which is particularly bad news for 2 of Minnesota's endangered native mussels, the elephant ear and the ebony shell. Because mussels are such long-lived animals, we still may have living individuals of these species in Minnesota, but without their principal fish host to grow and disperse their young, their days are kind of numbered in Minnesota. So if you don't know, native mussels, fish are a really important part of their life cycle. Many of them, so they fertilized eggs develop into these larvae, and they will disperse these larvae into the water. Many of them create elaborate lures that look like aquatic insects or even look like a little swimming fish. A fish sees that and attacks it. They release these larvae into the fish's gills, where they bind on and develop for a time before they drop into the substrate and develop into adult mussels, which is really fascinating. But it is bad news for mussel species when their host fish can no longer access our waters. So sadly, no skipjack herring ultimately will probably mean no elephant ear or ebony shell in Minnesota. Now let's meet the slender mad tom. So mad toms are miniature members of the catfish family. We have three species of mad tom in Minnesota: the tadpole mad tom and the stone cat, both of which are pretty common and widespread, but none of them get very large. This is an adult slender mad tom here. And this is a good example of when we only have the tiniest fringe of the species range within our borders. The slender mad tom can be quite common in the heart of their range in the Ozarks, but are tremendously rare here in Minnesota and in Iowa. Slender mad toms require unaltered stream channels with riffle, pool, and run sequences, and they require relatively unsedimented gravel substrates, which is also a really vulnerable habitat in Minnesota. These fish like to squirm down into the gravel, and they're mostly active at night. So oftentimes in the day, adults are in adjacent pools, are burrowed into the gravel and riffles. You tend to see more young sheltering in riffles. So this fish only exists in a single stream in southern Minnesota, but among our endangered fishes, they are probably the easiest to survey for, because they um, are generally in small, easily wadable streams. So you can use seines or a backpack electrofisher to sample them, but very rare here in Minnesota. Next item up for bid is the pallid shiner, which is also kind of in the sweet spot for difficult to survey fishes. They're small, they're in backwaters, sloughs, and main channel boundaries of large continental rivers, and they are also superficially very similar to a whole host of other similar looking minnows that can be tremendously abundant in these habitats. So they're kind of the proverbial needle in a haystack and are considered rare throughout nearly all of the remainder of their native range. They have been extirpated from a number of large rivers in North America. This is another one that even in the earliest survey reports were just always a relatively minor portion of the fish community. They're just naturally in pretty low numbers. But it doesn't help that they are in habitats like this large river backwater that are difficult to walk, often too deep to seine. But seines and trawls are commonly used to survey for these. There's some indication that populations may be rebounding somewhat. There's been an uptick of recent occurrences in Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois. And the US Fish and Wildlife Service is currently working on a project to use environmental DNA to survey for these fish. So they will sample the water for DNA that is shed into the environment just from slime or wastes or that kind of slough off of the fish into the water. We are back to our friend the crystal darter. Historically, they were able to be sampled with seines in kind of the lower reaches of tributaries to the lower Mississippi, like the Zumbro and Root rivers. They're often in waters that are too deep to wade or use that type of sampling. They're also known to inhabit the main channels of the Mississippi and St. Croix rivers. So darters are members of the perch family, but they generally have a very reduced or non-existent swim bladder. They like to be down on the substrate and where they can shelter from current and not be blown downstream. They rarely swim up into the water column, and so they can be difficult to sample with electrofishing gear, especially in deep water. Um, this individual on my sausage-like fingers here is the only live individual of crystal darter that I've collected, and this was taken with an electrofishing boat on the main channel of the St. Croix River. A study was conducted by staff from fisheries research, long-term resource monitoring, and the non-game wildlife programs in the Ecological and Water Resources Division at DNR. The study was published in 2022, and the authors set out to sample rare darters in large river habitats using trawls. So these are nets that are dragged by a boat along the bottom of the riverbed. They towed trawls for at least 100 meters, and in most cases 250 or more meters, at 83 sites within crystal darter habitats in the Mississippi and St. Croix rivers, including locations where there were historical records and they didn't collect any crystal darters. So it does appear that they belong on the endangered list and are indeed quite rare. Interestingly, a kind of novel sampling method that is not commonly used for fish in Minnesota was unlocked by DNR mussel biologists, plural, who observed crystal darters in the St. Croix while scuba diving for mussels. So they could see them at night. They got some cool photos. They're out there. They're just really hard to get your hands on. So here are the 5 threatened species of fish in Minnesota. We have the plains top minnow, is this kind of blue-green iridescent fish here. They are members of the same group of fishes as like mollies and guppies and sailfins. They can actually see out of the water really well. A lot of these are also related to killifish. Banded killifish is another species in this group that we have in Minnesota. They can be difficult to sample for because they can see you coming. These are generally restricted to off-channel habitats in streams that drain to the Missouri River in southwest Minnesota. These are something you can easily collect with a seine or a backpack electrofisher, even if they can see you coming, but they're in small enough streams that you can get in there and go after them. This one here on the top middle is a gravel chub. This is a resident of high gradient gravel bottomed streams in the Root and Upper Iowa rivers. This is another species that's really highly sensitive to siltation and has disappeared from much of its historic range across the continent, particularly in populations outside of Ozarkia and Appalachia. This, pardon me, the pugnose shiner, which we will talk a little bit more about later, is a resident of clear lakes with diverse native plant assemblages. And we have 2 large river species here, the black buffalo and the paddlefish. So those are our 5 species that are considered threatened here in Minnesota. So I want to talk a bit about the paddlefish because they are super cool and they are a rare species that we actually have a lot of data and information for, unlike some of these other fish. They are migratory large river fish that some early biologists believed to be freshwater sharks when they first encountered them in North America. And they do have a very sharky look about them. They also have a cartilaginous skeleton. These are really ancient fishes, and they're closely related to the sturgeons, which, this group of ancient fish predate the dinosaurs by kind of a long shot. They're pretty crazy looking animals. They're always a big hit at the fish pond at the state fair. They have this long paddle shaped snout that is covered with thousands of sensory organisms that can detect microscopic organisms in the water, which is their source of food. So they swim with this huge mouth they have gaping open, and they filter these microorganisms out of the water with all of these tiny filaments along their gill arches. So you can see there's not a single tooth in the mouth of these huge fish. Um, like I said, compared to some of these other species we've talked about, paddlefish are a species we actually know a lot about in Minnesota, due in part to the large network of fish tracking receivers that we have throughout our large rivers. These are maintained by biologists in the East Metro, Hutchinson, and Lake City fisheries offices. We also have a telemetry network on the Red River of the North. However, that is outside of the range of paddlefish. Um, so we have over 75 wild paddlefish that have a transmitter that's been surgically implanted in their bodies that allows us to see where they go and when they do it. This large of a sample size allows us to see variation in individual behavior and better understand their seasonal movements. You can see fisheries biologist Joel Styrus preparing to carefully and delicately implant a receiver like this into the body of this paddlefish, which gets sewn up with some tidy sutures, released into the water, and the fish do fine. So here's a graphic displaying the movements of a single female paddlefish that has been tracked for over 10 years. Its home range is in the St. Croix River between Stillwater and the confluence with the Mississippi River. This is where it spends most of its time, most of the year. But roughly every other year, this fish migrates downstream into the Mississippi and up where it butts against Lock and Dam number 2 at Hastings. And about every other year, it has managed to get by the dam, and every time it has gone farther upstream into the Minnesota, presumably to spawn in the spring. So it's past the dam at Hastings, both by locking through the lock chamber, just like a barge, and also by swimming through the dam gates if they are open, kind of depending on flows in the river at the time. Like I said, each time that she has managed to make it into the Minnesota, she's moved farther upstream, so making a journey of over 200 miles and averaging over 30 miles of river a day, which is pretty mind-blowing and a good example of how important connectivity and the ability to migrate and move freely amongst rivers is really important for a lot of our fish species. So special concern species. This is kind of the largest category of our conservation designations. Like I said, there's 25 species currently on the list. They are all awesome and fascinating, but we won't have time today to do a deep dive on all of them. But just a couple I wanted to highlight here. This is the red-side dace, one of our coolest minnows. They have this really large mouth and big eyes. A large part of their diet is terrestrial insects or flying insects that fall onto the surface of the water, and they will come up and hit them off the surface like a trout. These are fish, if you ever catch them, put them in a bucket or aquarium, you definitely need a lid on there because they are agile jumpers and they will jump right out on you. This is a black red horse, which is the smallest and rarest of our red horse sucker species in Minnesota. Both of these two have that kind of southeast distribution I talked about earlier. And this here is our only species of fish in Minnesota that is on the federal endangered species list. And this is in some ways kind of a reverse of some of the other species that we've discussed. It's doing better within its range in Minnesota than it is across the rest of its distribution, where it's been extirpated from much of its historic range. And these fish are found in the same types of habitats as the plains top minnow that I talked about earlier. They don't like to be in the main channel of a stream. They prefer off-channel pools or even cattle ponds can sometimes be loaded with these things. And this is a species that the DNR, because of their federal designation, has actively monitored over the years, and it's something we pay pretty close attention to. But U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has also, in recent years, invested a lot of time and effort into restoring oxbows and meanders of streams that have been channelized or kind of reduced this off-channel habitat that they require, and it appears to be making a difference and having some success. So it's always nice when there's good news with our rare and endangered fishes. So if you'd like to see a full list of our listed species in Minnesota, please visit this website. Like I said, this will be dropped in the chat. You can see a list of all of the other animals and plants that are threatened, endangered, or special concern in Minnesota. So we've talked mostly about river-dwelling fish up to this point, but I'd like to highlight a few rare species that are found in lakes. And one of our programs in fisheries that launched in 2011 has really yielded a tremendous amount of information about these rare fish in lakes. And this is when DNR began to systematically sample the nearshore fish communities and lakes using seines, backpack electrofishers, and small mesh trap nets to collect the small-bodied fishes in the nearshore area. So here we can see a lake biological monitoring and assessment team with a backpack shocker sampling in the nearshore area. So a lot of these are species that were not typically detected by the type of sampling that was generally focused on monitoring game fish populations. There are a few of our rare fishes that are highly dependent on clear water, diverse native vegetation, and are benefited by relatively unaltered shorelines. So one of these that I mentioned earlier is the pugnose shiner, perhaps the most adorable and one of our rarest lake-dwelling minnows. They are highly dependent on clear water and abundant, diverse native plants. So their habitat is sometimes in conflict with development and human activity in lakes. This happened to me a number of times out sampling for these, where you might chat with a landowner by their dock and they ask, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, we're collecting these really cool rare fish that you have in your lake here." And in many cases, the next question they ask is like, "Oh, wow, that's really cool. Who do I call to get rid of all these weeds?" So like I said, there can be some conflict with development and human activities in lakes, but charming little fishes. This individual is a male that's just starting to get in spawning coloration. They will turn this a really bright gold. They get their name because they have this teeny tiny little mouth that gives them a pug-nosed appearance. The northern sunfish was recognized as a distinct species relatively recently. It was previously considered to be a subspecies of the long-eared sunfish that is common throughout the Ozarks and Appalachia. This is an adult male seen here posing for a portrait on a clamshell. They are really small, generally under 6 inches in length, and are not commonly caught by anglers. I think this is the one time in all of my fish surveying days where I actually used angling as a method. I was with uh, Tyler Winter in the Boundary Waters, and we could see small sunfish over nests, but it was really difficult to use a seine. And Tyler had in his fishing kit a number of tiny hooks, and just with a small piece of plastic put on a little hook, we were able to catch a bunch of these things with fishing poles because we couldn't quite manage to get them with a seine. But very beautiful little sunfish. Finally, this tiny fish is an adult female leaf starter, which is the smallest vertebrate in Minnesota, and in the running for smallest vertebrate in North America, although there's two recently described species of a really small killifish and a really small frog that apparently have beat it out in recent years. But these are frequently associated with a native algae that looks a lot like a vascular plant. It's called Chara, or you may have heard it referred to as skunk grass or musk grass. So in lakes where there's lots of that habitat available, if you have a really fine mesh net and go looking for them, you might get your hands on a really cute leaf starter. With that, I'd be happy to open it up for any questions.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Brett, for taking your time and to sharing these great information on the rare fishes. And again, everybody, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Slido page, and you can find that right down the bottom on the right-hand corner. Yeah, so it looks like we already have a question here. Let me. Something just blocked me out here. Is there any way I can move these? Oh, okay, there you go. So the first question that we have for you is, how much do zebra mussels or other invasive aquatics affect these rare fishes?
Boy, that is a good question. Yeah, so zebra mussels can any invasive species can kind of cause a cascade of changes in a lake. As far as invasive species that are particularly problematic for state threatened pugnose shiner and the special concern leaf starter and northern sunfish are invasive aquatic plants that can really choke out native vegetation, and pugnose shiners in particular really don't do well in monocultures of aquatic plants. Even if they're native plants, they like really require diversity, and you rarely find any of those three species in lakes that have become overrun with like curly leaf pondweed or Eurasian milfoil. But water quality, or excuse me, water clarity is often tied to the plant community. As we lose water clarity, light doesn't penetrate as deep into the water, and you can lose some species of native plants that way. So yeah, it's possible that there are lakes where some of these species have benefited from the increased water clarity we often see with lakes that are infested with zebra mussels, but specifically, I don't know for sure about their direct impacts on some of these things.
Okay, thank you for that. I don't know if we have any more question. Okay, oops. The next question says, can you explain how the Minnesota conservation status is different from the national conservation status and how they might interact with each other?
Gosh, I should have gone to law school. Well, they're really kind of independent processes, and each state kind of has their own way of managing their own rare and endangered plants and animals. From what I understand at the federal level of how species are evaluated is, just wide scale loss from a significant portion of their range, but that would be their range within the entire country and not within state boundaries. So, for example, fathead minnow, which is what you would most commonly see in a bait store as bait. I have sampled in other states where the fathead minnow is considered threatened or endangered in that state just because a tiny portion of its range peaks within the boundary of that state. So yeah, it really varies from state to state as to how it relates to federal law. But like I said, the Topeka shiner is special concern in Minnesota, but it's endangered at the federal level. Just because it doesn't meet those criteria of like imminent risk of extirpation that is local extinction within its range in Minnesota.
Okay. Thank you for that. If anybody have any question, please drop them on here. Otherwise, yeah, it's been an interesting topic. I myself did not know the rare fishes out there. So this is a great information, and yeah, thanks for the sharing. So for the next Mars session, it will be on the moose research, which is the next 2 weeks on the 29th. Yes. So we have another question for you, right? What time of the year do you do the sampling, and how often?
Well, it really varies by species, I guess. A lot of times in fish sampling, the timing or the method at which you sample fish is like driven by the question you're trying to answer. And in many cases with these really rare fish, your main question is just, are they present or absent here? So it's almost always in the summer, I guess I would say, in the open water season. In some cases, particularly like with Topeka shiner monitoring, they can be easier to distinguish from the hyper common and widespread sand shiner when they start to get into spawning coloration. I mean, you can still tell even if they're not in that coloration. You may avoid certain types of years or certain times of the year if it is right in the middle of when they are spawning. Also, just as to not disturb that activity. Again, these are rare animals we're trying to protect and conserve. With I guess another example would be northern brook lamprey and southern brook lamprey. Those kinds of surveys are generally early in the spring because those are both species that are not parasitic lamprey and they don't feed as adults. So they will they have a long larval stage where they are this kind of worm-like organism that is in the substrate that's filter feeding microscopic foods out of the water, and they don't in the spring they will transform into an adult lamprey with eyes and an oral disc, and they really only exist as adults to spawn and then die. So you can find them in low numbers later in the year, but your best bet is early in the year when water temps are like around 50 degrees to find them. So that's an example of two species where your targeted surveys might be pretty seasonal.
Okay, thank you for that. Do we have any more questions? Otherwise, we could end the session early. Let's just wait another maybe 2 seconds. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, then thanks again everyone for attending this session. And again, next 2 weeks we'll be talking about moose research. So if you love moose or don't love moose, please stop by. And yeah, thank you again, Brett, for taking your time and then give us this great information. Thanks,
My
everyone.
pleasure.
I'll
Thanks for
see you guys. Yeah, I'll see you guys next time.